This is the Washington Times front page for Monday, April 17th, 2023. Thanks for starting your week with us. I'm George Gerbo. House Republicans will start considering a plan to raise the debt ceiling when lawmakers return to the Capitol this week, while the Senate will grapple with a key vacancy that's holding up President Biden's judicial nominees. Susan Ferricchio reports House Speaker Kevin McCarthy is putting together legislation that pairs a one-year increase in the debt ceiling with spending cuts and other spending limits. The proposal isn't ready for floor consideration, but some Republicans say the House should take up the measure this month. The Treasury Department says the government will run out of ways to pay the nation's bills as early as June unless Congress grants more borrowing authority. In the Senate, there are 14 nominees awaiting approval from the Judiciary Committee, and at least 4 of them probably can't advance without a Democratic majority. Without California Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein, who will not return to Washington as she deals with shingles, the committee will be deadlocked 10-10 on several nominees who lack bipartisan support. More than 100 mostly Democratic-leaning cities and counties have launched pilot programs for guaranteed basic income. Valerie Richardson reports the programs provide no-strings-attached payments via debit cards to sample populations with the goal of creating an income floor for people living on the edge of solvency. Supporters of guaranteed basic income say the goal is to lay the groundwork for a national program. Free market proponents say such a policy could replace the $1.1 trillion federal social welfare network. Most advocates aren't calling for the concept of a universal basic income, meaning checks for everyone regardless of income, but rather a guaranteed or unconditional basic income that's targeted to low-income Americans. Taxpayers and consumers are beginning to pay costs for the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline as state legislatures pass bills to add fees to phone bills or add budget funding for the call centers. Sean Salai reports Colorado, California, Nevada, Virginia, and Washington have created taxes to fund the call centers by adding 12 to 50 cents to monthly phone bills. Another 6 states are considering similar fees. Congress designated the 988 dialing code in 2020 and authorized state governments to levy telecommunications fees to cover the costs. Virginia was the first state to enact a tax for that in March of 2021. The fee adds 12 cents a month to the cell phone bills of Virginians with subscription wireless plans. Those with prepaid wireless services pay 8 cents per retail transaction. You can read all of these stories at WashingtonTimes.com/front page. You can also find the entire lineup of Washington Times podcasts at WashingtonTimes.com/podcasts. The Biden administration is pushing a revamp of lagging U.S. relations with Africa. Guy Taylor reports the charm offensive has included a summit of continental leaders in Washington, a parade of high-level diplomatic visits to resource-rich nations, and a promise of private investments. Analysts say, however, the White House has barely managed to counter the trade and economic inroads and political influence that China has established on the African continent over the past decade. Violent crime is surging across America's major cities, but voters in those same urban centers are rejecting candidates running on law and order platforms. In Chicago, Cook County Commissioner Brandon Johnson narrowly won a Democratic primary runoff against former Chicago Schools Chief Paul Vallas, who vowed to make Chicago the safest city in America. Harris Alec reports Johnson benefited from a concerted push by the city's teachers' unions, which held a grudge against Vallas over his support of charter schools. Similar themes have played out in mayoral elections in Los Angeles and Milwaukee. And finally, it was in the 1970s when the Supreme Court first looked at whether religious employees could be forced to work on their Sabbath. Stephen Dinan reports the issue returns to the court again this week. The case involves a mail carrier who celebrates the Sabbath and asked the U.S. Postal Service to make sure he had Sundays off of work. The tension springs from the First Amendment's religion clauses, which bar the establishment of religion, even as they guarantee the free exercise of worship. Find all of today's front page stories at WashingtonTimes.com/front page or on the Washington Times app, and find us whenever you get your podcasts. Just search Washington Times in any major podcast app. You can also find us on Twitter and Instagram at Wash Times for breaking news, sports, commentary, and more. For the Washington Times, I'm George Gerbo.